Somewhere over the Tibetan plateau, a helicopter climbs through air so thin it would stall the engines of most Western designs. It barely notices. 60 years ago, China could not build a single rotor blade without foreign help. Every gearbox, every turbine, every rivet came from somewhere else. Today, it fields one of the largest and most varied helicopter fleets on the planet, built for high mountains, dense jungle, open coastline, and crowded city rooftops, all at once. Some of these machines started life as French sports helicopters. Others were copied, quietly and deliberately, from Cold War Soviet transports. A few are brand new, still wearing test paint, already being compared in defense circles to the American Apache. This is the complete story of every rotor currently flying for the Chinese military, how each one got there, what it can actually carry into combat, and why a handful of them could tilt the balance of power in the sky over the next decade. We start where China itself started, borrowing. Chapter 1: Borrowed Rotors, the helicopters that taught China to fly. In 1976, China did not possess a heavy helicopter of its own design, so it bought the blueprints instead. Under a technology transfer agreement with France, Shanghai Aircraft Industries began building a license copy of the Aerospatiale Super Frelon, a bulky, three-engine machine that became the Z-8. The Chinese-built prototype flew in December 1985, and the type entered service in 1989. Three engines gave it redundancy that twin-engine designs lacked, useful for a helicopter expected to fly troops, cargo, and even naval mine countermeasure gear off the decks of Chinese warships. For more than a decade, the Z-8 was the only heavy lift option the People's Liberation Army had, and it was never elegant. Pilots who flew it in the 1990s describe a cockpit crowded with analog dials and a fuselage that vibrated noticeably at cruise speed. But it worked, and in military aviation, working reliably often matters more than looking modern. Later batches added improved gearboxes and stronger blades after early accidents exposed weaknesses in the original French design, lessons the French themselves had already learned the hard way decades earlier with the Super Frelon in its own service. While the Z-8 handled the heavy lifting, something smaller and cheaper was needed for everyday utility flying, transporting officers, running supply routes, evacuating the wounded. That gap was filled by the Harbin Z-9, built under license from the French Eurocopter Dauphin, starting in the early 1980s and entering wider PLA service around 1992. The Z-9 looked almost unremarkable. Twin engines, a simple cabin, seating for a handful of troops or a stretcher case. Its real significance was never what it carried on any single flight. It was what it eventually became. Engineers used the Z-9 airframe as a foundation for an entire family of Chinese helicopters, armed scouts, naval patrol variants, even the country's earliest attempts at a dedicated attack helicopter. Strip the Z-9 out of this story, and at least three other aircraft on this list simply never get built. Medevac crews flying the basic Z-9 have credited the type's tight turning radius for allowing landings in mountain clearings that larger helicopters simply could not reach. A small detail that rarely makes headlines but has likely saved lives in remote border regions over the decades. This one was different. In December 1994, Changhe flew the Z-11, a light helicopter copied from the French AS-350 Écureuil, known internationally as the Squirrel. On paper, it looked unglamorous, a trainer and liaison aircraft with barely any weapons capacity at all. But 2 decades later, Chinese engineers looked again at that same small airframe and saw untapped potential. The armed Z-11WB variant, first flown in September 2015 and inducted into PLA units somewhere between 2017 and 2021, can carry anti-tank missiles, unguided rocket pods, and door-mounted machine guns, and it can even launch a small Su-6 drone straight off its own weapons rack. A 2-ton helicopter, once used purely to teach cadets how to hover in place, now flies reconnaissance and light attack sorties for active Army aviation brigades. Few people outside China even remember this one exists, but it quietly filled a tactical gap that none of the country's larger, more expensive gunships were built to reach. An export variant, marketed abroad as the Z-11E, has already been sold to an African customer, making this unassuming trainer turned gunship one of the very few Chinese attack helicopters to actually leave the country under contract rather than remain purely domestic. Foreign blueprints gave China its starting fleet, 3 separate designs, 3 separate countries of origin, but borrowed designs could only carry the PLA so far into modern warfare. The next chapter belongs to the helicopters China finally built entirely on its own terms. Chapter 2, First Blood. China builds its own gunships. For decades, the People's Liberation Army watched other nations field dedicated attack helicopters and had nothing comparable of its own. That changed with the Changhe Z-10, China's first purpose-built gunship, developed with support from the 602nd Research Institute and first flown on the 29th of April 2003. Development was not smooth. Early prototypes were underpowered, and it took years of engine refinement before the Z-10 finally entered service in late 2010. What emerged was a tandem cockpit attack helicopter with sloped composite armor plating, a chin-mounted 23mm cannon, and 4 hardpoints capable of carrying up to 16 anti-tank missiles depending on the mission profile. Its pilots wear a helmet-mounted sighting system that lets them aim certain weapons simply by turning their head toward a target, a concept familiar from Western attack aircraft but implemented here with entirely Chinese electronics. By the mid-2010s, somewhere between 150 and 200 Z-10s were already spread across more than 10 Army aviation brigades nationwide. An export version, the Z-10ME, has since been photographed carrying the CM-502 kg precision-guided missile, extending its strike range well beyond older laser-guided anti-tank weapons, and it has already entered frontline service with Pakistan, the type's first international customer. Chinese state television has openly compared the Z-10 to the French-built Eurocopter Tiger, claiming better range and easier handling, a bold comparison for a helicopter that was still working through serious engine reliability problems less than a decade earlier. The Z-10 could not be everywhere at once, and building enough of them to saturate every brigade proved slow and expensive, so the PLA turned once again to the Z-9 family for a cheaper answer. The result was the Harbin Z-19, a lighter, single-engine armed reconnaissance helicopter that entered service in 2012. Cheaper to build, faster to produce, and simpler to maintain in the field, the Z-19 gave Army aviation brigades a nimble scout that could also strike on its own, carrying HJ series anti-tank missiles alongside the TY-90 air-to-air missile for self-defense against enemy helicopters and low-flying aircraft. Where the Z-10 became the hammer of Chinese Army aviation, the Z-19 became something closer to a scalpel, flying ahead of advancing ground units to identify targets before the heavier gunships ever arrived on scene. Pilots reportedly nicknamed it the Fox for its narrow nose and quick, low-altitude turns through valley terrain. Because it shares so many components with the unarmed Z-9, factories could shift production between the two versions depending on which one the Army needed most that year, a flexibility the more specialized Z-10 could never really match. This one rarely gets credit outside its own country. The People's Liberation Army now had 2 attack helicopters working in tandem. What it still lacked was mobility on a truly massive scale, the ability to move an entire army by air across difficult terrain. That problem demanded a completely different category of aircraft. Chapter 3, The Transport Backbone, Moving an Army by Air. By the 2010s, the original Z-8 design was showing its age, so Changhe answered with the Z-8C, an upgraded variant fitted with composite rotor blades, modernized avionics, and a redesigned nose-housing weather radar for longer-range operations. It was less a new helicopter than a careful modernization of an aging workhorse, extending its service life and giving crews improved reliability for extended transport and search and rescue missions in difficult weather. It rarely appears in glossy Chinese military media, overshadowed by newer, flashier designs, but it remains one of the busiest airframes in the entire fleet, quietly logging thousands of hours that nobody outside the program bothers to publicize. Where the Z-8C modernized an old idea, the Avicopter Z-15 represented something genuinely new, a real joint venture between China and Airbus helicopters. Originally developed under the designation EC-175. Certified for Chinese service in the early 2010s, the twin-engine Z-15 filled a gap between the light Z-9 and the much heavier Z-8 family, handling utility transport, liaison duties, and increasingly, naval support tasks aboard smaller surface ships, where deck space is tight and a smaller footprint than the Z-20 family genuinely matters. It stands out as one of the few helicopters on this entire list built through genuine international collaboration rather than reverse engineering or license production, a detail that still surprises people who assume every modern Chinese military aircraft was simply copied wholesale from somewhere else. Civilian versions of the same airframe now fly offshore oil support missions around the world, which means the very same rotor system quietly overlaps between commercial charter flights and naval liaison duty, depending entirely on which customer signed the paperwork. Heavier lift for China's rapidly growing amphibious fleet came from the Harbin Z-18, which entered service around 2014, built on Z-8 heritage but substantially redesigned with more powerful engines and a considerably larger cabin. The Z-18 was purpose-built for operations off China's amphibious assault ships, capable of ferrying troops, light vehicles, and supplies from ship to shore in a single lift rather than several smaller trips. Specialized variants have also been adapted for airborne early warning duty, carrying a rotating radar dome that extends a ship's detection range well beyond the horizon, a role usually reserved for far more expensive fixed-wing aircraft in most other navies, and one that took Chinese naval planners years of trial and error to get right given the sheer weight of a rotating radar dish mounted so high above the fuselage. A fully loaded Z-18 lumbering off a flight deck at maximum weight remains one of the more dramatic sights in Chinese naval aviation footage, rotors flexing visibly under the strain before the aircraft finally clears the ship. Not every transport helicopter in Chinese service was actually built in China. The Mi-17, a Russian-designed medium transport, has been imported in growing numbers since the 1990s, valued less for sophistication and more for sheer stubborn ruggedness. It shrugs off dust, high altitude, and rough field handling better than almost anything else in the inventory, which is exactly why it still flies alongside far newer domestic designs in the mountainous and remote regions where reliability matters more than elegance ever will. Some of these airframes have logged well over 3 decades of continuous service, outlasting several newer Chinese designs that were supposed to replace them entirely. Few people expected a Cold War Russian import to still be earning its keep this deep into the 21st century. Transport helicopters kept the Army moving forward, but by the late 2010s, China wanted something that could do almost everything at once: carry troops, fly at altitude, and fight if the mission suddenly demanded it. Chapter 4. Black Hawk's Shadow. The Z-20 family takes over. The Harbin Z-20 is, visually at least, almost impossible to mistake for anything else. Broadly similar in overall layout to the American UH-60 Black Hawk, it entered PLA service in 2019 and quickly became the backbone of China's entire air assault capability. Powered entirely by domestically developed turboshaft engines, a genuine milestone after decades of relying on foreign power plants, the Z-20 was specifically engineered for high-altitude performance, the kind needed to operate reliably above the Tibetan Plateau, where thin air grounds many other helicopters within minutes. It carries troops, cargo, and increasingly sensors or weapons depending on the mission set, and it has become the platform Chinese engineers now build almost everything new around, including several of the aircraft still waiting later in this story. Chinese media has shown Z-20 units training for rapid insertion behind rugged terrain, troops fast roping down from the cabin within seconds of the aircraft reaching a hover, a tactic that depends entirely on the kind of stable, high-altitude handling this helicopter was built specifically to deliver. One of those derivatives is the Z-20T, a gunship-configured variant that retains meaningful troop-carrying capacity while adding a genuine attack role, effectively blending transport and firepower into a single airframe rather than splitting the two missions across separate aircraft. Confirmed in PLA service in 2025, the Z-20T reflects a broader shift in Chinese military thinking. Rather than designing an entirely separate specialized helicopter for every possible mission, reuse one proven platform and adapt it as circumstances require. It is a genuine hybrid, not quite a dedicated gunship, not quite a pure transport, but useful precisely because it does not have to choose one identity over the other. This one still confuses foreign analysts trying to classify it under a single, tidy category. On land, the Z-20 family had already reshaped how the PLA moves troops and fights at the same time. At sea, an entirely different set of helicopters was quietly doing something similar for the Chinese Navy. Chapter 5: Hunters at Sea, China's Naval Helicopter Fleet. The naval version of the Z-20, designated the Z-20J, trades the standard wheeled undercarriage for folding rotor blades and a strengthened airframe built specifically for shipboard life, along with a dedicated maritime search radar in the nose. Confirmed operating from Chinese amphibious assault ships in the early 2020s, it extends the Navy's own aviation reach without depending entirely on older, smaller naval helicopters that came before it, a quiet but genuinely significant expansion of what Chinese warships can see and reach far from the mainland coast. Before the Z-20J arrived, that job largely fell to the Harbin Z-9D, a dedicated anti-submarine and anti-surface variant of the original Z-9 airframe. Fitted with search radar, a dipping sonar lowered directly into the water, torpedoes, and anti-ship missiles, the Z-9D has spent years operating routinely from the decks of Chinese frigates and destroyers, hunting for submarines that Beijing insists are never actually intruding, at least not according to any official statement. It is smaller and considerably older than the Z-20J, but it remains numerous across the fleet, and in naval aviation, sheer numbers still matter enormously. Some Z-9D crews train extensively for night operations, lowering their sonar into open water in near total darkness, guided almost entirely by instruments rather than any visual reference to the horizon. The type's compact size means a single Chinese frigate can often carry only one, leaving little margin if the aircraft is grounded for maintenance during an extended deployment far from home port. Not every naval helicopter in Chinese service was designed inside China at all. The Kamov Ka-28, a Russian coaxial rotor design with no tail rotor whatsoever, an unusual configuration for dedicated anti-submarine work, has served aboard planned destroyers and frigates since deliveries began in the late 1990s. Its stacked, contra-rotating main rotors make it compact enough to operate from smaller ship decks while still carrying a full sonar and torpedo suite internally. It is a design compromise the Soviets perfected decades earlier during the Cold War, one that China simply adopted wholesale rather than attempt to reinvent from scratch. A crew of 3 typically operates the aircraft, 1 pilot up front and 2 sensor operators, working sonar, radar, and weapons release from a cramped compartment behind, hunting quietly for hours over open water. Paired with the Ka-28 in some Chinese task groups is the Kamov Ka-31, delivered from 2010 onward, an airborne early warning helicopter carrying a large rotating radar array slung beneath its fuselage. It gives Chinese surface groups a genuine ability to detect low-flying aircraft and incoming missiles well beyond the radar horizon of the ships themselves, a capability normally associated with expensive, fixed-wing early warning aircraft rather than a helicopter that folds down to fit in a standard hangar. Two Russian designs, still flying today, still quietly filling roles that China's own naval helicopters have not yet fully replaced. That gap alone says something about how difficult airborne early warning radar remains to build well, even for an industry advancing as quickly as China's. Attack helicopters, transports, and naval hunters make up the overwhelming majority of the Chinese fleet. But a small handful of helicopters exist purely to move people who never see combat at all, and one more exists to bring firepower nobody outside the program has fully seen revealed yet. Chapter 6: Beyond the Front Line, VIP Transport and the Next Generation. Not every military helicopter in Chinese service exists to fight. The Eurocopter AS-332 Super Puma, a French design acquired from the 1980s onward, has quietly handled VIP transport, search and rescue, and coastal patrol duties for decades. A reliable medium-lift aircraft doing entirely unglamorous work far away from any headline. Its successor within Chinese service, the larger and considerably more modern Eurocopter EC-225, extends that same VIP and special mission role with greater range and cabin space. Acquired through the 2010s for tasks that reward comfort and reliability far more than raw firepower ever could. Its larger cabin and longer legs, making it the preferred choice whenever a senior official needs to cover real distance rather than a short hop between nearby bases. Together, these two French designs remain a quiet reminder that even as China indigenizes almost everything else in its arsenal, a handful of specialized, low-volume roles still lean on proven foreign engineering rather than a homegrown alternative. Both types have occasionally appeared in flood relief and disaster response footage too. A reminder that even helicopters bought for officials and generals sometimes end up hauling emergency supplies to villages cut off by rising water. This one was different too, though nobody has said so officially. Photographs of a new prototype first surfaced on Chinese social media in March 2024, showing a helicopter noticeably larger than the Z-10, with a broader fuselage, clearly derived from the Z-20's own rotor system, engines, and drivetrain. Analysts have taken to calling it the Z-21, and clearer flight test footage circulating through 2025 and into 2026 has only deepened comparisons to the American AH-64 Apache. Estimated in the 10 to 12-ton weight class, the Z-21 is expected to carry a 30mm chain gun, up to 16 missiles spread across multiple hardpoints, and a mast-mounted sensor system similar in concept to the Apache's own longbow radar housing. Its engine exhausts angle sharply upward to scatter infrared heat signatures away from shoulder-fired heat-seeking missiles. And a mysterious rectangular fairing mounted beneath the nose has fueled months of open speculation online. A sensor pod, an electronic warfare suite, or simply extra internal fuel for longer-range strikes. Nobody outside the program appears to know for certain. The Z-21 is being developed jointly by Harbin, the company behind the Z-20's transport lineage, and Chenghe, the same firm that built the Z-10 more than 2 decades earlier, combining transport expertise with attack helicopter specialization under one program for the first time. If it enters service by the end of this decade, as many analysts now expect, the Z-21 would give China something it has genuinely never possessed before: a true heavyweight attack helicopter designed, engineered, and built entirely on its own terms, placing the country alongside only the United States and Russia in that particular weight class. From a single license-built Super Freilon rolling off a Chinese production line in the 1970s, to a stealthy new gunship still wearing unmarked test paint today, China's helicopter fleet has grown into one of the most complete and layered rotary wing forces found anywhere in the world. 18 distinct aircraft, 3 services, and one clear pattern running through every single one of them. Borrow what works, rebuild what doesn't, and never stop reaching for the next airframe. French sports helicopters became gunships, Soviet transports became naval hunters that never quite got replaced, and a Black Hawk look-alike became the seed for a heavyweight attack helicopter that did not exist even 5 years ago. Whatever comes after the Z-21 is still, for now, sitting somewhere in a hangar nobody outside the program has photographed yet, and that alone should tell you this story is far from finished.